All right, welcome back to Way of the Wrench and another episode of How to Become a Welder. On today's episode, we're going to talk about fusion welding, and I'm going to show you how to crank up the heat on your oxyacetylene set and do some gas welding. Yeah! So, let's go. So last video we were talking about brazing, where we kind of heat up the base metal so it's got kind of like a dull glow to it, and then we add our brazing rod, melt it over the top of it, and when it cools down it solidifies and holds our pieces together. So that's brazing, but today we're going to kind of go a little different route and we're going to talk about fusion welding. So fusion sounds like a really kind of fancy term. All it really means is that we are melting the base materials together. Now, sometimes it's just the base metals together, or sometimes you're adding extra material through the use of a filler rod. And if it's done properly, fusion welding will be stronger where you are welding than the actual base metals itself. Pretty cool. So the way that I'm filming this video series is that I'm trying to build up your skills so that we don't have to repeat a lot of the info when we do a new video. So because we're using the oxyacetylene equipment, I would recommend that you go and watch the safe use and setup and operation of a gas welder. I'd also recommend that you watch the brazing video because I show you how to take some material for your brazing samples and how to clean them up. So we're going to use the same exact material, same exact cleaning method. So watch that to get these ready. And then if you haven't already, I would watch the How to Become a Better Welder in 20 Minutes video. That way you get all my top tips and tricks on how to become a better welder in general. So all of these skills can go towards what we're doing today. All right, so the last video we were talking about how all of the different welders have a heat source. And so when we are gas welding, our heat source is our gas welding torch. And on the end of our torch body, we have to spin on one of these welding tips, and it depends on the thickness of the material that we are trying to weld together. Now, I could pretend I'm super smart and just start spouting off thicknesses for each of the numbers here, or flash a chart up on the screen for you guys, but at the end of the day, unless you are doing gas welding 40 hours a week, you're probably not going to remember that. So take a minute, just Google what size welding tip does what thicknesses before you start. Now, in general, there's some rules though. So the larger the physical size of the welding tip is, it's going to be a hotter flame, so you can weld thicker stuff. And to go along with that, there's a number stamped into the copper part of the welding tip, and the larger the number, the hotter the flame, the thicker the material you can do. So right here, I've got a number 4, a number 3, 1, and a 0. Now, I tend to weld really only up to about 1/8 of an inch with gas welding, so I'm generally using 0s and 1s only. And if it's anything thicker than that, I'm not going to be gas welding it if I've got another machine. It's a lot too slow for me. I'm going to grab a MIG welder and get the job done quick. Right, so once again, I've got my 1 inch wide, 1/8 thick, 4 inch long piece of flat bar steel. We've taken it to the wire wheel and we've cleaned up the edge and the sides next to that edge on both of our pieces. We are also going to be still doing an open corner joint, and we're going to be using a magnet to hold it in place until we at least get the ends tacked. Now, I really like teaching people on the open corner joint because you're not having to focus about where this liquid metal is running off to. It's going to sit up here kind of like a little trough and let you just focus on the puddle, let you focus where you're moving to, focus on the bead behind you, and learn those skills before we get into harder joints. So I'm going to start up the torch and I'm going to put a little tack on the one end here, let it cool down, see if my pieces move at all. If they do, I'm going to bend or hammer, twist them into the right spot that I need to, and then I can take the magnet away and tack weld the other side. That way everything's going to stay put while we do our gas welding sample. As opposed to brazing here, when we're trying to heat this up, we don't just want that dull red orange glow. We actually have to get the surfaces shiny. Now, because I'm trying to tack this, I want to make sure both sides go shiny. And once they both go shiny, you can go back and forth to break the surface tension so the puddle goes together. Once it's together, back it off and let it cool down. Now, at this point, we don't need the magnet, so you can take the magnet off. And reposition your pieces exactly how you want them. So if it's got a twist in it or a gap, make sure it's exactly how you want it. And for me, it looks great. It hasn't really moved that much for me. So I'm just going to turn it around and I'm going to throw another tack weld on this corner. Okay, make sure both pieces have the same amount of heat. They're both just starting to go shiny. Liquid metal on top. And like I said, just go back and forth, break that surface tension, get them to go together in one puddle. All right, last time before we start welding this, it looks great. There's no gap, there's no crookedness to it. It's ready to go exactly how I want. So at this point, we're going to start welding this. All right, so for this sample, I'm not going to use any filler rod and show you what that looks like. I've got a neutral flame here, and I do have to get my previous tack kind of liquid again before I start moving. Now you got to watch that you don't get it too hot, so as soon as you get it liquid, you got to start moving. So I've got a puddle, now I'm just going to start slowly moving, and it's all about keeping your movements nice and steady. If you go too quick, you're going to have the seam start to appear. If you have any holes, you got to fill them in as you go. You don't want to miss them and try to come back and fill them in later. And I'm making sure my heat is aimed evenly at both. If you can, try to take a peek at what your weld bead looks behind you. Nice, smooth, steady movements. If it starts to get too cold and the gap kind of appears, then slow down. Make sure that your puddle turns into one puddle again. Now, as I get near the end of the piece here, there's going to be a ton of heat and really nowhere for that heat to dissipate. So I'm going to have to back off, and I might have to actually regulate the heat with the torch just by moving the torch away. Okay, remelting my other tack, and off to the end. I like to get students doing this so that they kind of don't have to worry about the filler rod to begin with, and they just really focus on the puddle and really good heat control with the torch and being able to kind of make sure they know where they're going, watching the puddle and looking behind themselves to see that bead is nice and there's no holes. So I also teach them that this type of welding is not necessarily the strongest. I always add filler rod when I do gas welding because that way you can add more material and make it thicker and stronger than it was originally. But this is a really good practice way to try to have good heat and puddle control. It also doesn't give you much room to be able to add material at the beginning at the end, so you don't have any weak spots in your weld. But if you got a filler rod, you can definitely do that. All right, so if you're going to be doing some gas welding and you're going to be using filler rods, there's a couple things you need to know about these filler rods. First one is the filler rod material should be made out of the same stuff that your base material is. So for my samples, I was using carbon steel. So these are carbon steel filler rods, except they look like they're kind of shiny and they've got copper on it. And that's because they are actually coated with a very thin coating of copper to prevent these from rusting. And then when you weld with these, that thin layer of copper just melts off and doesn't interfere with your welding. But if I was welding aluminum, I'd have some aluminum filler rods or stainless, so match with whatever you're doing for your base materials. The other thing you should be worried about with your filler rods is the actual diameter of the filler rod that you grab. So for example here, I have a 1/16 diameter, 3/32, and a 1/8 inch diameter. Now, as a general rule of thumb, I would never grab a filler rod that is bigger than the thickness of your material. Otherwise, the heat required to melt this thicker filler rod is going to be way more than your base metal can handle, and you're going to melt through it. Whereas if you go the other way, the only kind of bad thing that happens is that you may have to feed this faster because there's less material that you're adding, but this also gives you the option to add very little if you want. So another thing with gas welding with filler rods is where am I placing this filler rod while I'm welding? Well, you should be aiming it right to the center of your puddle, right underneath the center of where that heat source is coming from our torch. That way you can very quickly get in there, melt, deposit some material, and get it out without any issues. Now, when people start in the beginning, they tend to kind of deposit it near the front of the puddle. And what happens is it melts the filler rod to the base material, and then all of a sudden this rod is stuck, and we can't do anything until we actually interrupt our welding, move the torch over, melt it off of the base material, and then try to go back and reheat the puddle and restart our weld bead, which is going to be pretty tricky to try to hide that. So once we got a handle on where we are aiming our filler rod, the next thing we need to be concerned about is how often I'm dipping my filler rod and how long it is staying there in between the dips. And that's going to affect how much material is getting deposited down. So while I am doing this, I need to be watching my weld bead behind to see if it's flat, meaning I need to have some more material, or whether it's kind of lumpy and quite round, and that's probably maybe too much filler rod. So I'm going to be changing either the length of time between my dips or the length of time that I'm keeping it there and continuing to melt in more material. So my suggestion is start to weld more like a robot. Get into a certain rhythm that you kind of keep doing. And as you're doing that and moving in the direction of your welding, you need to look back at your weld bead and then make adjustments on the fly. So if you need to speed up or slow down. And that'll affect how much material you are depositing with your filler rods. Now, the cool thing about gas welding and TIG welding is the fact that we have a separate heat source from our filler rod, so we don't have to apply both if we don't want to. Now, why this is cool is as we are welding, if we are monitoring our weld bead behind us and we notice that there's a little bit of an inclusion or a little hole in our weld, rather than just powering ahead because we can't really fix it, we can actually quickly back up, reheat this. So this is our kind of a new puddle, and often that little pop will kind of just melt out. And if it doesn't, you can kind of help supply just a little bit more filler rod to get it to fill in. And then when it looks great, you just keep going as usual. And at the end of the day, you won't even notice that you had that. So quite cool. Can't do that with MIG or stick. All right, so we got another sample here. I'm going to do the same tack process just to kind of hold it in the right spot while we're welding. And the only thing different we're going to do this time is this one's going to be with filler rod. I just straightened it up, made sure it's exactly where I want before I put my second tack in. Alright, so same deal. We got to get the tack weld that's there kind of liquefied again. And now that I've got a filler rod, I am able to add to the filler rod to kind of build up that corner so I don't have a crack or kind of like a weak section in my weld. Now I have to regulate my heat by pulling the torch away, otherwise I'm just going to melt the corner up. And once I've got a nice enough bead, then I can start moving. Now, because we are gas welding and not brazing, we don't have to regulate the heat as much. In fact, we need a little bit more heat, so we can leave it there. And we are moving very slowly and steady. And your filler rod has to go right into the center of the puddle. If you put it near the edge of the puddle, what happens is it sticks and melts to the base metal, and it won't get freed up until you put some heat on it and actually unmelt it. So once you get into the rhythm, you kind of start moving like a little bit like a robot. And then if you have to start and stop, that's fine. Just make sure there's no crater there. Just slowly move along. Take a look at the bead behind you so you can make any adjustments. If you notice there's any holes, stop, back up, fill it in, especially since you now have the addition of the filler rod. If you notice it's twinkling quite a bit and lots of sparks coming off, it might be getting too hot, so you can regulate the heat by just backing up the torch. And if you're doing a good weld here, you kind of don't want a flat looking weld behind you. You kind of want kind of a slight round shape to it. That's actually adding a little bit more strength, a little bit more material. And we definitely don't want it kind of dipping underneath the surface of the metal. That means we're definitely not giving it extra metal. Now, same thing when I get to the end here, I do have to regulate the heat a bit more. Otherwise, there's nowhere for that heat to dissipate to, and you're just going to make a mess and melt the corner off. Okay, and we don't want to just end the corner either. We want to have some meat there so that there's not a weak spot or a starting point for where our welds might want to crack. There we go. All right, with any kind of weld that you do, you should always kind of take a look at it and see if there's something that went wrong, what went right, and that way you're kind of always improving your welding going forward. So let's diagnose this guy. Now, one of the first things I like to look at is the very beginning and the end of my weld bead. Is there a hole or a crater? Can I see my original tacks that I don't have enough material covering over that? I didn't melt them in. Can I see a seam between the two pieces because I don't have any material there? And in this case, that looks okay. So I was able to regulate my heat and get some material in here at the beginning before starting my weld bead. And at the very end, I didn't just all of a sudden kind of stop welding and pull it away and leave a crater there. So that looks pretty good. Now the next thing I like to look at is when I am moving my puddle in the direction of travel, if I'm doing it nice and slow and steady, you're going to end up with these kind of C patterns in your weld bead. And it should be very evenly spaced between each of those C's. If it's not, what's happening is you are kind of pausing, getting a puddle, adding some material, and then quickly rushing forward a couple of millimeters, doing the same thing, adding more material, rushing forward. And that's where you get these kind of bloopy patterns and irregular spacing between these C's. So something to look for that. The other thing I like to look for is if I flip this to the side and I'm looking at the top of the bead, this should be very even. If it's sitting up, then that means that I have put too much filler rod. It might be cold. If it's got some dips in it, and it's got a flatter look to it, maybe even melting through, then that's obviously too hot and probably too slow of my motion. So if you've got everything right and dialed in, this should be nice and flat and not going up and down and up and down. So that's looking pretty good on this one. And then one of the last things I like to look for is if you look at the end here, you can see that I have kind of like a nice round hump here. I don't have it kind of flat on the top, which means it's gotten too hot and I don't have enough material. But in this case, I've added enough material to give it that hump, and that's going to give it lots of strength. Now, the other thing it should have is when you look down the side, there should be a little bit of kind of like a mushroom cap, meaning that the weld bead is kind of sitting on top of this a little bit with just a little lip on the edge, as opposed to having this undercutting, which means it's melted into the base metal and kind of robbed the base metal of some material to add to the puddle. So in this case, we've got a little bit of that, so that's good. And the other side has a little bit more, so that might have been the side that I was favoring with the torch. I'd have to look back at the video to see which side I favored. But overall, really nice weld. Another thing, there's no holes in here. Because if there was any holes while I was welding, I would have paused, backed up, filled it in, maybe even added some extra filler rod to fill in the hole before I moved forward. So, nice looking weld. All right, so this is the sample without filler rod, and so we can kind of diagnose this too. So you can see that I wasn't able to add any extra material near the ends, and so that's kind of the hole and the weak spot that I was talking about that should not be there when you're using filler rod. And otherwise, we've got nice C patterns in here all the way along. There's no holes. The top is relatively even height. And there's no mushroom cap to the side because there's no extra material added, but there isn't any undercutting either, so that was good. Now, one thing I wanted to show you, this is strong, but it's not as strong as with filler rod because if you look at it from an end point, you can see that we're missing that kind of hump that we had with the other one. So it's more kind of flat And you can tell that right in our weld bead, it's thinner here than it actually is in the base material. So this is technically going to be the weakest spot in this part now, whereas if we had the weld bead hitting up, it would be as strong as this, or maybe even stronger, depending on how much height we have on that weld bead. Now, one of the benefits of working with an experienced welder is that when you make your welding sample, you can show it to them and say, hey, what do you think of this? And they can tell you right off the bat, oh, that's too hot, that's too cold, you're going too fast, you got an oxidizing flame, etc., because they're using their experience. So really hard to do this with a welding video on YouTube. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly weld up a bunch of samples, and they are all going to be crappy samples. So either they're going to be too hot or too cold, or welded with an oxidized flame, show some popping, that kind of stuff, and then we'll go through that after. All right, so let's diagnose this sample. Now, half of the sample I did too hot, and half of it I did too cold. Now, when you're gas welding and you're controlling the heat source, that can also just mean your movement speed is too slow or too fast, so keep that in mind. Now, this half here is too cold, and it's really obvious because it looks like bird poop. Basically, just big irregular lumps sitting on top of the surface. You can even see the original little spots there of the top surface. It's even worse on this side, and you can tell that it is not melted or fused into the base metal. Lots of little inclusions, so that puddle did not get hot enough to kind of spread out and melt to the next piece. So really obviously too cold on this. Now this side is really too hot, and you can tell first off because it's got kind of like a dry gray kind of ashy look to it. It looks burnt, and when I was doing that, there's lots of little twinkle sparkles kind of coming off of it. And the other clue is there is not a lot of overlap. There's actually kind of some undercutting happening where the puddle is robbing the base metal to kind of put it towards the center to try to make a bead for you. At the very end, you can see lots of heat melted the corner off as well. So too hot and too cold. And like I said, this can also be a movement speed problem where you are moving too fast, and because you're not putting enough heat because you're just going too fast, then you get a colder looking weld. And if you are going so slow that the heat is staying there for way too long, then you're going to get a hot condition. So sometimes just increasing or decreasing your travel speed will help with this as well. Mama Bear's weld was too hot, and Papa Bear's weld was too cold. But Baby Bear's weld was just right. So here's another sample here that has two other common conditions found when gas welding. On this side of the sample, this is irregular movements with the torch. So rather than making a puddle, filling it up, and slowly moving over in the direction of travel as you kind of robotic-like, rhythmic-like put in your filler rod, this person has made a puddle, put in some filler rod, and then jumped over about 4 or 5 mil and made another puddle, filled it up, jump again. And so you can literally see that in the movement. There's 1 puddle, 2, 3, 4, instead of nice little C's that are evenly spaced out. And when you're doing that, you can also have little inclusions and holes where you've kind of actually jumped so far that you've actually made a gap, and there's some missing sections here. So that's irregular movements. On this side of the sample, once again, we've got that kind of burnt look. It's kind of ashy and it's kind of dull gray. That's going to tell us that we are either too hot, or in this case, the condition is that we were not welding with the neutral flame, we're welding with an oxidizing flame. So when I was welding this with the oxidizing flame, it was also kind of sending off a ton of sparks and kind of like little twinkle things coming off of this. And that's another hint that something's wrong. It's either too hot or you've got an oxidizing flame. Now the other tell is you can see there's all these little kind of porosity holes in here. Couple more all throughout the weld, and that's telling you something's not right. And in this case, this was an oxidizing flame. Another issue that you may have with gas welding is something called popping. Now, popping is when you are sitting there welding, concentrating, minding your own business, and all of a sudden it goes pow, and there's a big shower of sparks, and that usually knocks out your flame. If that happens, very quickly shut off your gases because we don't have any future issues. And a couple things have happened. First off, you might have just had the flame blown out, which at this case is just the gases coming out and you're okay, just shut it off. But sometimes that popping continues and you'll hear like a brrrr inside of here. And what's happening is there's a flame kind of happening and little mini explosions right in your welding tip. That's not really good for long term. Like you got to shut that off right away. And then the worst case scenario is that you actually have that flame front carry on up through your torch, through your hoses and into your bottles. And that's called a flashback, and that can be pretty devastating. So that's why we run with flashback arresters to prevent that one from happening. So if you have a pop happen, just shut off your valves. That way you're safe. That's a pop. If you're having some issues with popping during gas welding, there's actually a long list of things it could be, so let's run through them. First thing, take a look at your regulators. That's an easy one. Make sure that both gases are flowing at whatever it should be for the welding tip that you have picked. Second thing, I would get yourself a set of tip cleaners and really clean out that orifice. Make sure there's no debris in there that is blocking proper gas flow. Third thing, take a look at your materials. Make sure that there is no debris or mill scale and something that's going to make it pop when you start welding it. And fourth, take a look at the distance that your welding tip is from the puddle or the heat, because as the end of this welding tip starts to get hot, you can actually get the gases to explode inside here, hence the pop. And one of the last things is oxidizing flame. If you hear a really loud sound and you got a really sharp cone, that's an oxidizing flame, and it's way too hot, and it's going to be giving lots of sparks off of it and then eventually popping. So lots of stuff to look for when you're having issues with popping. So we've got a pretty looking gas weld here, but the real question is it strong? Well, remember, fusion welding, if done properly, should be stronger than the metal around it, meaning that it'll break the base metal before you weld. So let's squish it in the vise and see what happens. As I take a look at this welding sample along the weld bead along the edge of both sides and through the top, there's not a single crack, any signs of weakness. There's some mill scale came off when we bent it, but if we look at the end shape of it, no cracks, no damage, nice and strong bend, and a little bit of weld was on the inside, so when I tried to squish this in the vise, it actually started bending and deforming the base metal. So once again, that weld bead is going to be stronger if done properly than the base metal. So overall, nice looking and very strong gas weld. There's a wrap in another video from Way of the Wrench and on how to become a welder, this time on a bunch of good stuff about gas welding. So if you have any questions or concerns about what happened in the video, why don't you put them down below in the comment section and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And if you haven't already, hey, why don't you follow us on Instagram, Way of the Wrench. That way you're getting all the pics and stories and videos and things that are going on in the shop in between our videos. And man, what is this? Episode 7 of a welding series. You guys are getting skills, man, if you're sticking through this. And maybe we should ramp it up. So maybe next episode we will continue with some gas welding, but we'll do a harder joint. We'll do a butt joint, talk about keyholes, and getting another second weld bead underneath the weld. Wouldn't that be kind of cool? Well, until next time, take it easy.